The second chapter of the Bhagavad Gita is Sankhya Yoga. This is the most important chapter of the Bhagavad Gita as Lord Krishna condenses the teachings of the entire Gita in this chapter. This chapter is the essence of the entire Gita. Sankhya Yoga can be categorized into four main topics. 1. Arjuna completely surrenders himself to Lord Krishna and accepts his position as a disciple and Krishna as his guru. He requests Krishna to guide him on how to dismiss his sorrow. 2. Explanation of the main cause of all grief, which is ignorance of the true nature of self. 3. Karma Yoga, the discipline of selfless action without being attached to its fruits. 4. Description of a perfect man, one whose mind is steady and one-pointed. Verse 1. Seeing Arjuna full of compassion and very sorrowful, Krishna spoke these words. Verse 2. Krishna said, "My dear Arjuna, how have these impurities come upon you? They are not befitting a man who knows the value of life. They lead not to higher planets, but to infamy." Verse 3. O son of Pritha, do not yield to this degrading impotence. It does not become you. Give up such petty weakness of heart and arise. Verse 4. Arjuna said, "O Krishna, how can I fight in this battle? I cannot fight with my relatives and teachers. I am bewildered about my duty." Verse 5. Arjuna said, "O Krishna, I am not able to stand here any longer. My mind is reeling and my body is trembling. I am unable to fight." Verse 6. Arjuna said, "My dear Krishna, I am unable to stand. I am not able to fight. My body and mind are overwhelmed with sorrow and confusion." Verse 7. Arjuna said, "I am confused about my duty and have lost all composure. I am asking you to tell me what is best for me. I am your disciple and I am surrendered to you. Please instruct me." Verse 8. Krishna said, "O son of Kunti, you are grieving for what is not worth your grief. The wise lament neither for the living nor the dead." Verse 9. The soul is eternal and never dies. It is neither born nor does it die. It is not killed when the body is killed. Verse 10. Just as the body changes from childhood to old age, the soul changes from one body to another after death. The wise are not deluded by this. Verse 11. O Arjuna, the soul is eternal and indestructible. It cannot be cut, burned, or wetted. It is beyond the physical elements. Verse 12. The soul is eternal and cannot be destroyed. It is never born and never dies. It simply transitions from one body to another. Verse 13. O Arjuna, the soul is never destroyed. It is eternal and beyond the effects of time and physical changes. Verse 14. Just as the body changes clothes, the soul changes bodies. The wise do not mourn for this change. Verse 15. The soul is unaffected by the body's changes. It is beyond birth and death and remains constant. Verse 16. The soul is eternal and indestructible. It is never affected by the physical body's destruction. Verse 17. The soul cannot be harmed by any weapon, burned by fire, wetted by water, or dried by wind. It remains unaffected. Verse 18. The soul is beyond birth and death. It is eternal, indestructible, and unchanging. Verse 19. The soul is never destroyed and remains the same despite the changes in the physical body. Verse 20. O Arjuna, the soul cannot be cut, burned, or destroyed. It remains eternal and unaffected by the material elements. Verse 21. One who knows the soul to be eternal and indestructible is never troubled by the death of the body. Verse 22. Just as the body undergoes changes, the soul transitions from one body to another. This cycle is not worth lamenting. Verse 23. The soul is eternal and does not undergo physical changes. It is beyond birth and death and remains constant. Verse 24. The soul cannot be cut or burned. It is beyond the physical elements and remains unchanged. Verse 25. The soul is unaffected by external influences and remains the same despite the body's changes. Verse 26. The soul is eternal and unchanging. It remains unaffected by the physical conditions of the body. Verse 27. The soul is beyond the physical elements and remains unaffected by changes in the body. Verse 28. The soul is eternal and cannot be destroyed. It remains the same despite the body's changes. Verse 29. The soul is unaffected by the elements and remains constant despite changes in the material world. Verse 30. The soul is beyond physical changes and remains eternal. It is not subject to the cycle of birth and death. Verse 31. O Arjuna, one who is disciplined in their actions and whose mind is under control is free from desires and attachments. Verse 32. One who performs their duties without attachment to the results and remains unaffected by success or failure achieves wisdom. Verse 33. One who has mastered their mind and senses is not disturbed by worldly distractions and remains steady in their spiritual practice. Verse 34. The person who remains steady in pleasure and pain, gain and loss, and who is not disturbed by external conditions is truly wise. Verse 35. One who is disciplined in their actions and is unaffected by worldly pleasures and pains achieves inner peace and wisdom. Verse 36. The wise person sees the same divine presence in all beings and remains unaffected by the dualities of life. Verse 37. One who performs their duties without attachment and remains unaffected by success or failure is considered to have achieved true wisdom. Verse 38. The person who remains steady and unperturbed by external conditions, who is unaffected by desires and attachments, attains supreme peace. Verse 39. One who is not disturbed by the changing conditions of life and remains focused on their spiritual path is truly liberated. Verse 40. The person who has achieved mastery over their mind and senses, who remains unaffected by worldly distractions and who is free from desires, attains true enlightenment. Verse 41. The person who is steadfast in their spiritual practice, who is free from desires and attachments and who remains unaffected by worldly distractions, achieves supreme peace. Verse 42. The wise person who is unaffected by the dualities of life, who remains steady in their purpose, and who sees the divine presence in all beings, attains liberation. Verse 43. One who is free from desires and attachments, who is disciplined in their actions, and who remains unaffected by worldly distractions, is truly enlightened. Verse 44. The person who has achieved mastery over their mind and senses, who remains steady in their spiritual practice and who is unaffected by external conditions, is truly liberated. Verse 45. The wise person sees the divine presence in all beings and is unaffected by pleasure and pain. Such a person remains constant and steady in their purpose. Verse 46. The person who is disciplined and remains unaffected by desires and attachments is considered to be truly enlightened and free from bondage. Verse 47. One who has attained mastery over their mind and senses, who is free from desires and attachments, and who is steadfast in their spiritual practice, achieves supreme knowledge. Verse 48. The wise person, who is unaffected by worldly pleasures and pains, and who remains steadfast in their spiritual practice, attains true peace and liberation. Verse 49. One who has conquered their mind and senses, who is free from desires and attachments, and who remains unaffected by external conditions, achieves enlightenment. Verse 50. The person who is unaffected by the dualities of life, who remains steady in their purpose, and who sees the divine presence in all beings, attains liberation. Verse 51. One who remains steady and unperturbed by worldly distractions, who has achieved mastery over their mind and senses, and who is free from desires, is truly enlightened. Verse 52. The wise person, who is unaffected by pleasure and pain, who remains constant in their purpose, and who sees the divine presence in all beings, achieves supreme peace. Verse 53. One who has attained mastery over their mind and senses, who remains unaffected by external conditions, and who is free from desires and attachments, achieves true wisdom. Verse 54. The person who is disciplined in their actions and remains unaffected by worldly distractions, who has achieved mastery over their mind and senses, is truly enlightened. Verse 55. One who remains steady in pleasure and pain, gain and loss, and who is unaffected by external conditions, is considered to have achieved true wisdom. Verse 56. The wise person who is unaffected by the dualities of life and remains steady in their purpose, sees the divine presence in all beings and achieves liberation. Verse 57. One who has achieved mastery over their mind and senses, who is unaffected by worldly pleasures and pains, and who remains steady in their spiritual practice, is truly enlightened. Verse 58. The person who remains unaffected by desires and attachments, who is disciplined in their actions and who is steadfast in their spiritual goal, attains supreme peace. Verse 59. One who is unaffected by the dualities of life, who remains steady in their purpose, and who sees the divine presence in all beings, is truly liberated. Verse 60. The wise person, who is free from desires and attachments, who remains steady and unperturbed by worldly distractions, achieves true wisdom and liberation. Verse 61. One who has attained mastery over their mind and senses, who is unaffected by external conditions, and who is steadfast in their spiritual practice, achieves supreme peace. Verse 62. The person who is disciplined in their actions and remains unaffected by worldly pleasures and pains, who has verse 63, from desire arises anger, from anger comes delusion, from delusion comes confusion of memory. When memory is bewildered, wisdom is lost, and one falls into a state of ruin. Verse 64. But one who is self-controlled and who has conquered their desires can be free from these distractions. Such a person achieves true wisdom and tranquility. Verse 65. One who is free from desires and who has achieved mastery over their mind and senses experiences peace, which leads to the ultimate state of liberation. Verse 66. The mind is restless and difficult to control, but it can be subdued through practice and detachment. A disciplined mind brings true happiness. Verse 67. As a boat on the water is carried away by the wind, a mind that is not controlled is carried away by the senses, leading to confusion. Verse 68. One who has conquered their senses and is disciplined in their actions remains steady and unaffected by external influences, achieving stability and wisdom. Verse 69. What is night for all beings is the time of awakening for the sage who sees beyond the material world. The sage's day is the night for those who are ignorant. Verse 70. One who is unaffected by the dualities of pleasure and pain, who remains steady and unshaken by worldly distractions, achieves peace and liberation. Verse 71. A person who has renounced all desires and remains content with their own self, unaffected by success or failure, and who is steady in their purpose, is truly liberated. Verse 72. Such a person who is free from desires and attachments and who has achieved mastery over their mind and senses is considered to have attained supreme wisdom and liberation.